In 1818, high on a bluff in Kingsport, Tennessee, a grand mansion was raised where the north and south forks of the Holston River meet. The mansion was christened as Rotherwood. However, the encroaching Holston River not only carries water, it carries tragedy, it carries blood, and above all, it carries secrets. For over 2 centuries, the mysterious Rotherwood estate has been tied to one of the most tragic and terrifying Southern Gothic legends in Appalachian history. They say if you stand on the banks of the river at dusk, you might see the most famous local apparition, a figure in a floating white dress, searching the dark water for the young man she was supposed to marry. But if you walk the manor grounds, when the moon is high, you might encounter something far more sinister. A massive, red-eyed phantom hound, said to have clawed its way straight out of hell to claim the soul of Rotherwood's most tyrannical master. Welcome to Haunted Hollers and Eerie Encounters. I'm your host, Stormy Skies. Tonight, we're taking a journey into Sullivan County, Tennessee, where we will explore the brutal past of the frontier plantation, its many heartbreaks, and the lingering legends of Rotherwood Mansion. Close your curtains, turn down the lights, and let's step into the shadows of the Holston River. To understand why Rotherwood feels so haunted today, you first have to understand what East Tennessee looked like in the early 19th century. Long before Europeans built homes along these bluffs, the Holston River was the beating heart of transportation and survival. It was a watery highway. The Holston served as the main means of travel for many people, including the Cherokee, whose communities and hunting grounds were part of this valley. Later, traders traveled the river with flatboats loaded with salt, timber, and whiskey, and eventually steamboats carrying passengers into a rapidly growing East Tennessee carved their way through the mountain valleys down towards the Tennessee River. If you controlled the high ground overlooking the confluence of the north and south forks of the Holston, you controlled the gateway to the valley. And in 1818, one man set his eyes on that exact bluff: Reverend Frederick Augustus Ross. Frederick Ross was not your typical preacher. Born in Virginia to David Ross, a wealthy Revolutionary War patriot and industrialist, young Frederick inherited vast fortunes, land claims, and enslaved laborers. He was highly educated, deeply articulate, and intensely charismatic. Ross was an ordained Presbyterian minister who became a central figure in the Great Awakening of East Tennessee, co-founding the Calvinistic magazine and hosting massive theological debates that drew crowds from hundreds of miles away. Ross wanted a homestead that reflected both his earthly stature and his spiritual ambitions. He selected a dramatic, elevated bluff where the two rivers merged in present-day Kingsport. Inspired by Sir Walter Scott's classic novel, Ivanhoe, Ross named his estate Rotherwood. The construction of Rotherwood was an ambitious undertaking on the Tennessee frontier. The original 1818 mansion was built as a huge 22-bedroom villa, flanked by grand porticos and towering columns. From its wide balconies, one could look out over hundreds of acres of lush river bottoms, orchards, manicured gardens, and farmland. Inside the home featured imported furnishings, grand fireplaces, and extensive personal libraries. On any given weekend, Rotherwood was filled with the sounds of classical music, visiting theologians, politicians, and wealthy travelers who had navigated the Holston River to enjoy Reverend Ross's famed hospitality. But to tell the whole story of Rotherwood, we must look beyond the regal columns of the imposing estate. The elegance of Rotherwood was sustained entirely by the labor of dozens of enslaved men, women, and children. They cleared the wilderness, molded the bricks, cooked the lavish meals, and worked the riverbanks from sunup to sundown. The estate depended on these enslaved people to maintain its prestige, and as such, its history was intertwined with grief and suffering long before any ghost stories were recounted. Sitting atop that high bluff, Rotherwood represented wealth, religious influence, and social power. It was an estate built on the edge of a changing frontier, and like many places built on that frontier, its foundation was far more complicated than the beauty of the landscape suggested. By the late 1820s, the focus inside the Rotherwood was Reverend Ross's eldest daughter. Historical accounts describe Rowena as the pride of Sullivan County, intelligent, gentle, and widely admired throughout the Holston Valley. When she fell in love with a young man named David Vance, the locals prepared for a wedding that promised to be the grandest social celebration East Tennessee had seen in years. But the story took a tragic turn that would eventually become the foundation for the legend of the Lady in White spotted along the riverbanks. Rowena was to be married at the estate. Carriages lined the dirt roads leading up the bluff. Guests gathered on the sprawling lawns, drinking wine and listening to musicians play beneath the shade of ancient oaks. Upstairs in her bedchamber, Rowena stood before a tall glass mirror in her flowing white silk wedding gown. She walked over to the balcony window, looking down past the terraced gardens toward the Holston River, waiting for her groom to arrive. But something was wrong. The musicians stopped playing. Heads turned toward the river. Voices that had been filled with celebration suddenly became frantic. To reach Rotherwood from across the valley, David Vance and his companions boarded a small wooden skiff to cross the river. Before modern dams and water management, the Holston River was notoriously dangerous. Deep channels, jagged hidden limestone, and sudden mountain runoff could turn a peaceful river crossing into a death trap in seconds. David's skiff pushed off into the current. Halfway across, right where the north and south forks collided, a sudden surge of water struck the boat. The skiff capsized instantly. Standing at the high window of Rotherwood in her wedding dress, Rowena watched in absolute horror as her fiancé was thrown into the turbulent current. David Vance fought against the weight of his wool clothes and the churning river, but he was pulled beneath the surface. Guests rushed to the shoreline. Men shouted for ropes. Others launched their own skiffs into the current. But the Holston had already claimed him. He drowned within full view of the mansion. The wedding feast turned into a living nightmare. Rowena was consumed by a suffocating grief that never truly left her. As we examine the historical records versus the regional folklore, years later, Rowena did attempt to rebuild her life. She eventually married a gentleman named Edward Temple, but tragedy pursued her. Temple died of a sudden and fatal case of yellow fever just months after their union. Broken by compounding loss, Rowena later married a doctor named George Hale, but her health collapsed, and she passed away at the young age of 42. That is what the geological records say. But Appalachian oral folklore told a far more tragic ending. In the stories passed down through Kingsport, Rowena, overcome by grief and visions of her drowned lover, dressed once more in her white wedding gown, walked down the banks of the Holston River, and waded into the dark water to join David Vance in death. For over a century, local residents, fishermen, and travelers along the Ridgefields area have reported seeing the Lady in White. They describe a luminous, weeping figure in a gown wandering the riverbanks at dusk, searching the water, or standing motionless beside the high, dark windows of Rotherwood Mansion. Her father was a deeply controversial figure. In 1857, he published Slavery Ordained of God, a book defending the institution of slavery through scripture. Today, historians view the work as an example of how religion was used to justify human enslavement in the antebellum South. That complicated legacy remains part of Rotherwood's history. By the mid-1840s, Reverend Frederick Ross found himself in deep financial ruin. Mismanaged land and economic downturn stripped him of his wealth. In 1847, Distraught and heavily in debt, the Reverend was forced to sell his beloved Rotherwood estate. The buyer was Josh Phipps, Ross's plantation overseer. In historical archives, Joshua Phipps is documented as an ambitious, shrewd landowner who expanded the property's agricultural output, but in local folklore, Phipps transformed Rotherwood from a place of religious refinement into a place of absolute dread. Where Reverend Ross had maintained a facade of aristocratic decorum, Phipps ruled Rotherwood with an unyielding and cruel hand. According to local tradition, Joshua Phipps earned a reputation as a harsh and unforgiving master. Historical records document his ownership of the estate, but many of the darker stories surrounding him survive primarily through oral history, rather than contemporary documentation. Neighbors claimed that the atmosphere around Rotherwood grew cold, heavy, and oppressive. People began avoiding the road beneath the bluff after dark. Then came the summer of 1861. As the Civil War erupted across the nation, Joshua Phipps was struck down by a mysterious fever that left him bedridden in the master bedroom of Rotherwood. According to regional accounts, as Phipps lay dying, unnatural events began. A huge swarm of black flies materialized inside the bedchamber, coating the walls, the windows, and the bedposts despite every effort to drive them out. But the flies were only the beginning. Out on the front lawn, emerging from the tree line beside the river, eyewitnesses claimed to see an unnaturally large black dog with eyes that burned like glowing red coals. Legends of phantom black dogs appear across much of Europe and eventually found their way into Appalachian storytelling through early settlers. Folklorists often referred to these creatures as death omens. Phantom hounds were said to appear just before someone took their final breath. Night after night, as Phipps writhed in agony upstairs, the beast sat on the lawn directly beneath his balcony window, howling a horrific and mournful sound into the night. On the night Joshua Phipps passed, a sudden and violent thunderstorm broke over the river valley. The moment his heart stopped, the fly swarm instantly vanished. Outside, the massive hound let out one final, deafening howl and disappeared into the storm, leaving no trace behind. Thus was born the legend of the Hound of Rotherwood, a red-eyed phantom beast said to roam the bluffs to this day, heralding tragedy and ruminating on Rotherwood's dark master. The story of Rotherwood does not end with Joshua Phipps. In fact, the house itself carries a history as turbulent as the spirits said to inhabit it and the waters below. Many pictured Rotherwood as the untouched 1818 house, but the physical structure has undergone dramatic transformations. Following the Civil War, the original 1818 villa built by Frederick Ross suffered extensive damage and eventually destruction by fire, a common fate for grand antebellum estates left vulnerable during the Reconstruction era. Imagine standing across the river and watching flames consume the grand mansion that had stood over the Holston for nearly half a century. Smoke rolled through the valley, visible for miles, as neighbors gathered helplessly below the bluff. The Rotherwood you see today is not the same physical timber and brick touched by Frederick Ross or Rowena in 1818. The mansion was rebuilt and remodeled over generations, changing hands through families like the Netherlands and later becoming integrated into the modern Ridgefields residential community of Kingsport. Today's mansion features sweeping neoclassical columns, updated brickwork, and modern amenities standing as a private residential home. Yet despite the fires, the architectural rebuilds, and the changing floor plans, the ghost stories never left. And that brings up a question. If the original physical walls built in 1818 no longer stand, why do the stories remain? Why do the people still see the lady in white on the riverbank? Why do drivers in Kingsport still report seeing a shadow of a massive hound slipping through the fog along the bluff? Perhaps it's because a haunting isn't anchored to the wood, mortar, or brick. As is a repeating theme, maybe the haunting is anchored to the land itself. Maybe it attaches to the limestone bluffs, the soil tended by enslaved hands, and to the violent waters of the Holston River that have witnessed many tragedies since the frontier was born. Paranormal investigators often point out that locations where tragedy occurred become places where the unexplained is prevalent. Skeptics argue that paranormal expectations fuel unusual experiences. Believers argue that the land remembers. Today, Rotherwood Mansion sits quietly within the Ridgefields neighborhood of Kingsport. Modern paved streets, manicured lawns, and suburban homes now surround the historic bluff. But ask the locals who have lived in Sullivan County for generations, and you'll find that the legend of Rotherwood is very much alive. Throughout the 20th century and in modern times, local newspapers, regional folklorists, and neighborhood residents have documented strange experiences around the property. Drivers navigating the winding roads near the Holston River at night have repeatedly reported sudden and unexplainable plunges in temperature. Others describe seeing a mist rise off the river that seems to take the shape of a woman in a long dress, standing near the water's edge before disappearing into thin air. Local high school students and nighttime travelers have told stories of encountering a shadowy canine figure standing on the shoulder of the road near the mansion grounds. A shadow much larger than any domestic dog, with eyes that catch the headlights in an unnatural crimson glow before vanishing into the tree line. Whether you view these reports as genuine paranormal encounters or as the enduring power of regional folklore, one thing is certain: Rotherwood has earned its place as the premier Southern Gothic tale of East Tennessee. It blends the historical realities of frontier ambition, economic ruin, and human servitude, with the timeless elements of tragic romance and cosmic justice. The mansion still stands on its bluff, a silent monument to the light, the dark, and the shadows in between. Whether the spirits of Rotherwood are tied to the broken heart of Rowena Ross or the dark legacy of Joshua Phipps, the mansion remains a steadfast part of East Tennessee folklore. It stands as a reminder that behind great architecture and sweeping river views, the past often leaves stains that no amount of time can wash away. If you enjoyed today's story, please share the podcast with your spooky friends and leave a positive review. It keeps our campfire burning and helps other weary travelers find their way into our haunted hollers. If you have your own eerie encounter, a family legend, or a local ghost story you want to read on the show, send it to MyHollerStory@gmail.com. Your story just might be featured in an upcoming Eerie Encounters episode. And remember, your story doesn't have to come from the banks of the Holston River or the peaks of the Great Smoky Mountains. If you've experienced something strange, unexplained, paranormal, or just unsettling, I'd love to hear your story. I'll have all our episode sources and further reading linked in the show notes if you're brave enough to delve deeper into the shadows. The mountains and rivers of Appalachia have always carried stories. Long before the mountaintop communities, long before the bustling waterfronts, these valleys held secrets. And maybe beneath the quiet water, there are stories that are still yearning to be told. This has been Haunted Hollers and Eerie Encounters. Thank you for listening and for stepping with me into the shadows of Appalachia. Until next time, stay out of the hollers after dark.